Hello, everyone. This is Adam Fishman, Executive Director of American Friends of Likud, and I want to welcome you all once again to what we call the AFL Insiders exclusive briefing. And today we are joined by Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, Fleur Hassan Nahoum, who joined us. Actually, she did one of our webinars back in May of last year. And at that time, she was gracious enough to invite us to come visit when we came for our mission at Jerusalem Municipality at City Hall. And I had thought that by this time we probably would be doing that. But unfortunately, our trip has now been pushed off from the end of February to the middle of May, and I will be giving more details about that later. But without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Beiser, our President Club member and board member in New Jersey, who's going to give an official introduction and then turn it over to you, Fleur, for your briefing. Sarah?
Fleur, it's our honor or my honor to introduce you today. You serve as Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem in charge of Foreign Relations, International Economic Development, and Tourism. Fleur is the co-founder of the UAE Israel Business Council, an association of Emirati and Israeli business and government leaders fostering bilateral trade, innovation, and cooperation. And Fleur was born in London, grew up in Gibraltar, and emigrated to Israel 20 years ago in 2001. And now we turn our lunchtime briefing here in the States over to you.
Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's always lovely to be in a Zoom like this with what I consider family, my fellow Likud members, supporters, and it's wonderful to be here. The last time I was here, I think I gave a general briefing on the challenges and opportunities of Jerusalem. And so I don't want to go back and do the same thing. I want to talk about maybe some things that are going on today, some messages you may be getting in the press, and the current challenges at the moment in Jerusalem, the Sheikh Jarrah issues, the issues of East Jerusalem. And then I think it's always more fun when I open things up for questions and we have a real conversation. And if there's something particular that you want me to address, then please feel free. Nothing is off the table. I always say I'm in the Jerusalem City Council. Nothing can possibly ever offend me or catch me off guard. So I just want to address a couple of the recent issues. And let's go back to I think May. Did we meet before the conflict? I think we were meeting just after or in the middle of the conflict that happened last May.
I have to go back and check to see exactly when it was, but it certainly was around that time.
That's right. So I was giving you a briefing of why I thought that the conflict was happening. And I'll just give a brief summary on the main point, and that is that people try and suggest that the conflict last May happened because things are so bad. And my perspective is actually very different. I believe the conflict happened because things were going so well. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that we're seeing a movement towards normalization. First of all, if we take the macro look in terms of the Arab world with the Abraham Accords, we have a situation today that we would have dreamed of years ago, and that is that there's no longer an Arab-Israeli conflict because half of the Arab world have either made peace with us or are willing to make peace with us. And this, of course, is from the philosophy of Benjamin Netanyahu, that you don't bring people to the table for peace out of a point of weakness, but you bring them to peace from a point of strength. And that is why today we have peace with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and Sudan. God knows what's going to happen with Sudan, but many more countries that I believe will follow. Because there's been a shift in the Middle East, and the realignment of the Middle East means that the Middle East is not now anymore the Arab-Israeli conflict. It has realigned into the countries that want peace and prosperity for their people, and the countries that are radical and want destruction of the rest of the countries. That is a new realignment of the Middle East. And so when could we possibly have dreamt? This is also Jabotinsky's vision, that and Begin's vision, that out of strength comes people jumping on your train. And so today we're seeing a realignment in the Middle East, where you have Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the organizations and state sponsors of terrorism, and then all the other countries against them in the Middle East, like Israel, Saudi Arabia, that has become a de facto ally, and I believe an eventual peace partner for Israel. Of course, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, etc. And the reason why the conflict happened in May is because Hamas doesn't like that. They don't like the fact that Israel and the Arab countries are normalizing and becoming closer, because that kind of ruins their party. And so that's one of the reasons. The second reason is, of course, that in a countrywide level, the Arab-Israeli population, whatever we saw during the conflict, again, the radical elements sponsored and pushed by Hamas, but most of the Arab-Israeli citizens of this country are integrating more than ever, are in the highest places in universities, are reaching the heights of every profession. And again, Hamas doesn't like that. It makes them look bad. And ultimately, the third reason why the conflict happened last May is because Jerusalem is also going through its own mini Abraham Accords, where the Arabs of East Jerusalem are realizing that their salvation is not coming from the Palestinian Authority leadership. And so the open arms that the city of Jerusalem has had to the Arab residents of the city is now something that is being reciprocated. And we see more and more bridge building going on between the Arab community of Jerusalem and the rest of us. And so the reason why the conflict happened is because Hamas, the radical elements don't like this. And so where do we find ourselves today, almost 6-7 months after the conflict? And that is that life has essentially got back to normal. Also on the regional level, more MOUs are being signed every day than ever between government ministries in Bahrain, in the UAE, Morocco. There's more cultural exchanges, peer-to-peer exchanges, business councils such as the one I co-founded being created everywhere. Emirati sovereign wealth funds investing in Israel. We have huge investments in private equity firms. The biggest, I think, the most notable investment is that of Mubadala, which is the largest corporation in the UAE, buying a stake in Delek, which is our major energy gas exploration company of $1 billion. And so what we've seen is that at the end of 2021, we've had $1 billion in business between Israel and the UAE. And our prediction is that in 2022, we're going to see double that amount. And this is very, very exciting. And this is really changing the conversation in the country and changing the conversation in the region as a whole. And of course, it does not serve the radical elements anywhere in the Middle East. And going from the macro to the very micro, what's going on in Jerusalem at the moment with Sheikh Jarrah, which is what you're hearing, I'm sure, in the news and in different coverage, I had to just give a small briefing of the facts and not on what is reported and what the situation is about in Sheikh Jarrah. So what you'll hear in the news is that Israel is evicting Arabs from their homes, and that Israel and the city is demolishing Arab homes. The reality is, of course, far different. The situation that we had 2 weeks ago of the Al-Sarkhia family, who's caused so much reverberations around the world, is a very simple issue of illegal squatters that didn't move in 1948 or in 1967. No. These people moved in the 90s. They saw a plot of land. They know it didn't belong to them. It actually belonged to another Arab family called the Dawiyas. And the Al-Sarkhias moved in. They set up a business and they set up a home with absolutely no proof that they had any connection to this plot of land. The actual real owners of the plot of land were in a court case to kick them out because they were illegal squatters. In the meantime, the city that have been in painstaking process to try and plan out the optimal planning for the different Arab neighborhoods in Jerusalem, planned that this particular plot of land would be part of a belt of public use land dedicated to schools, dedicated to community buildings, dedicated to even religious buildings. And this plot of land fell into that brown zone, as we call it, which is public use buildings. And there is a very huge demand in East Jerusalem for special needs education. So in 2017, the city of Jerusalem planned a special needs school for Arab children. And when we went to measure the plot of land, we found this family squatting on this land. And from 2017, this family knew that they were going to have to leave. We begged them time and again to find a mutually convenient time for them to leave. We connected them to social workers in City Hall, to other people, other professionals that could help them relocate. But they knew they had to leave. And so they left it to the very last minute on purpose to create the headlines and the chaos for us to look bad. And with the true owners of that land, we are currently negotiating millions of shekels in compensation for us expropriating the land for the use of a special needs school. And that is what we're doing here. Unfortunately, Sheikh Jarrah as a neighborhood has been involved in many different issues. And so when people hear Sheikh Jarrah, they think of the fact that Jews are moving in and Arabs are getting kicked out. But of course, the case of 2 weeks ago of when this family had to leave, had to be evicted as a simple squatting issue, was conflagrated into a political issue with what happened last year, in last May, when a few families who again were not the true owners of the land, could never prove ownership, went to court to try and assert their rights. And the court said to them, look, you can't prove ownership. The ownership is not by you, but we will give you a very equitable settlement. And that is that you will remain as sitting tenants of this plot, of this apartment, of this house, until, and for your lifetime and the lifetime of your children. It was a very generous offer, very elegant compromise for the Israeli courts. And of course, these families would rather, cut their nose to spite their face, as my mother would say, and fight a cause they know they're going to lose in order to create the headlines that make Israel look terrible, and refuse a very, very simple settlement of a tenancy agreement, which makes them give up $100 a year, something ridiculous for them to stay. And of course, all of this being supported and egged on by the Palestinian leadership, who are quite happy to roll over their own people for the sake of a headline that harms Israel. And that is a completely separate issue to the issue we had 2 weeks ago. So all this kind of complication of one neighborhood and separate land and building and planning law violations in the world that doesn't understand nuance, and it's all about the oppressor and the oppressed, is what gets conflagrated into Israel is kicking people out of their homes, and Israel is, breaking human rights. Of course, nothing at all could be further from the truth. And what we are trying to do with a lot of public participation from Arab leaders in East Jerusalem is ensure that the neighborhoods are planned correctly, with enough green zones for parks, with enough brown zones for public use buildings, for neighborhoods to have proper functioning. And we're doing this hand in hand with the local Arab leadership that want to work with City Hall, because they understand that we are the people who are actually going to be able to help them have a decent life of opportunity. So that is the Sheikh Jarrah issue at the moment. And unless there's something specific, Adam, that you think, or Sarah, that you'd like me to cover, then I'm happy to have a conversation.
Yeah, just on that last point that you just made with respect to, it doesn't matter what the actual facts are, because there's always going to be a perception. and understanding what you're saying about working with the Arab leaders in the communities now moving forward, and the fact that there's the family that does own has now been compensated, or are they being is there an attempt to bring them into the fold, to use them in sort of a marketing form of fashion to get the word out, to make Israel's case from those very people who we are supposed to be oppressing, so to speak?
No, because they're trying to push up the ante to get more money from compensation. So unfortunately, they're not partners in telling the story. But what I can tell you is that that this Al Sakhir family that had no ownership rights from the beginning, about 10 years ago, tried to sell the land that they didn't own to Jewish organizations. And the Jewish organizations said to them, well, if you can prove ownership, we will consider it. And they could never. So not only are they illegal squatters, but they try to make money out of Jews. So the hypocrisy here is everywhere.
And that goes also for the Arab leaders who you are working with within the neighborhoods and within Jerusalem.
The Arab leaders. No, the Arab leaders that we're working with will talk. I took a couple of journalists about 2 weeks ago to East Jerusalem to show them the reforms that we're doing in the schools, all the resources that we're putting into East Jerusalem. I took them to an organization that does development of small and medium-sized businesses, especially for women, including business loans. I took them to an innovation center and a city. What we've done is we've opened a center in one of the Arab neighborhoods for city services so that people don't have to come to Safra Square, and they can have city workers speaking in Arabic to understand their rights and to understand how the city works, and also to open classrooms for innovation, computer literacy, Hebrew, etc. So I took a group of journalists around to see all the bridge building that we're doing and all the resources that we're putting into East Jerusalem so that we can tell our side of the story. And we did take a Mukhtar with us, who is the Mukhtar, the chief of Silwan, Shiloach, and he himself said that yes, the City Hall has never been more cooperative, and that we are doing more public participation than ever, and that the Arab residents of East Jerusalem have understood that the only game in town and the only people who actually care for their well-being are the city of Jerusalem rather than the Palestinian leadership.
Fleur, with regard to Sheikh Jarrah, during that time, a Jewish congressman, someone actually who had gone to yeshiva, which made it even more startling, he came out and said that what was going on by the Israeli government was awful, and trying to throw these people out and expel them was awful, and it was legally wrong. And shortly after that, I don't know if you remember, but the New York Times ran on like the third page of the first section, it might have been on Sunday paper, which more people read. They profiled a number of, let's say, teenagers, 20 and 30-year-olds who were living in those homes. Never talked about the law, but profiled what wonderful people they were, how long they had lived there, and how the Israeli government was ruining their lives.
Yeah. In fact, these people, these young people.
You remember that article?
Yes, the Al-Kurds, which are these two young people, are making now a living from being Instagram stars by criticizing Israel. Meanwhile, they're still living in their homes. Nobody's evicted them, and they're quietly probably taking the settlement. But that will completely ruin their rebel star power on Instagram. They were made People of the Year. It's absolutely ridiculous. All they peddle in lies and borderline libel. And of course, everybody falls for it because, again, it's all about the oppressor and the oppressed. There's no nuance. It's the good guys and the bad guys. In this non-binary world that everybody's in, everything is completely binary when it comes to Israel.
Yes, and Jews. What about Israeli Arabs? I mean, there have to be some Israeli Arabs that resent the fact that these people who are now stars are actually living for free, when the rest of the world in Israel or everywhere else essentially does not live for free on land that they don't own. So what is the average Israeli on the street? What did they, Israeli Arab, what did they think about the situation?
Israeli Arabs, look, there's different, I think what the international community try and do, and this is what we saw recently with this ridiculous and libelous apartheid report of Amnesty International, of course, absolute lies total defamation. What they try and do is put all the different Arabs living here in the same bucket. So they take the Arab Israelis who have got passports, they're citizens for everything, same as me, and today are prosperous, are high-tech, successful people, people doing business with the Gulf, more Arab students in university than ever. They're citizens. Then you have the Jerusalem Arabs who are not citizens, but they are residents of Jerusalem, which means they have an ID card. And that ID card means they have education for free and they have health services for free, of course, same as me. I have 4 children. I've given birth 4 times, and every single time in a Jerusalem hospital, I have shared a room with an Arab lady also giving birth at the same time. Nobody talks about this or knows this. The only thing the Arab residents of East Jerusalem can't do is vote in national elections, but they can vote in local elections. 10% of the Arab residents of East Jerusalem have become citizens, and more in the last 10 years have decided that they want to be citizens of Israel. And the demand for citizenship is so high now that the Immigration Authority has opened an office in East Jerusalem just to deal with the new requests for citizenship. What they also don't tell you is that in East Jerusalem, more and more Hebrew classes outside of school, evening classes have opened more than ever, and more Arab residents of East Jerusalem are in Jerusalem universities and colleges than ever. They have woken up and smelled the coffee. Unfortunately, the world still hasn't.
If I can ask a question about, I know that you've had a key and pivotal role in the relationship between Israel and the UAE on the heels of the Abraham Accords. A question from our president, Jerry Platt in New York, because you'd mentioned it before that you believe it's in the near future with respect to Saudi Arabia. How far or near do you see that relationship? And can the UAE help convince the Palestinians, who we've just been talking about a little bit, that they can also benefit if they would attempt to take a different approach than they have up until now?
So that's a good question, the Saudi Arabia question. Officially, they say that unless the Israeli-Palestinian issue is sorted, they will not be seeking a normalization agreement with Israel. But when we look at Saudi Arabia and what's going on today, and we look at what was happening in the UAE 5 years ago, the UAE started with under-the-radar normalization with Israel. What do we mean by that? They started buying Israeli technology. There were Israeli businesses through third parties were working and very active in the UAE, and that eventually grew to an official normalization. What is happening in Saudi Arabia today? Under the radar normalizations. Israeli companies going in there quietly through third parties, more and more technology from Israel and innovation being bought by Saudi Arabia, and more under the radar visits by Jews and by Israelis to Saudi Arabia. So these things don't happen in a day. What I can tell you is the quiet under the radar infrastructure is being built already today. And Bahrain, where Bennett is visiting today, is a very close neighbor to Saudi. They have a bridge connecting Bahrain and Saudi, and they would never have normalized with Israel had Saudi not given them the nod to do so. So I envision that a lot of this under the radar normalization will be happening through Bahrain. And apart from Bahrain being an incredible partner, it's also a fantastic bridge to Saudi.
Fleur, I'm going to ask you what may be an unfair question. How's Bennett doing? From the Likud perspective, Bennett doing? Number one. Number two, how do you assess the strength or fragility of the coalition? And number three, if you can remember 1, 2, and 3, what do you think is the likelihood of your Lapid taking over from Bennett?
These
In
are all
any
great
order that you want
questions.
to answer.
Look, I think that this is a very complicated government because you have people with very, very different points of view. You have very strange bedfellows in this government. And so they are hanging on. How much they can actually do is yet to be seen. A poll came out yesterday, and the coalition seems to have lost popularity, and in fact the opposition has gained popularity. So I don't really know how to answer that question. There is, I will tell you something which I think is a very interesting anecdote. One of my portfolios in Jerusalem is economic development, and I spent 7 years, first as an activist and then as a city councillor and then as deputy mayor, developing the innovation ecosystem for Jerusalem, bringing in big companies, connecting academia to industry, and creating a real scene for Startup Nation here in Jerusalem, when 7 years ago there was nothing. It was all Tel Aviv, out of a belief that I have that diversity actually brings about very interesting innovation. So I was one of the founders of that ecosystem. And today I'm using my experience and connections to try and connect East Jerusalem, to try and connect the Arab engineers in East Jerusalem to the Startup Nation and create an ecosystem there, because it's in our interests to make sure that East Jerusalem has good economic development. And that actually was the whole philosophy behind the Trump plan, peace to prosperity. If you do economic development and you bring prosperity to people, they're much more likely to be in a place, in a position to talk about peace and normalization. And so I was in a meeting with an Arab Israeli from the north of Israel and a Palestinian from Ramallah, and we were talking about bringing Microsoft and Google to employ young Arabs. And at the end of the meeting, they say to me, "Fleur, can we ask you a question?" I said, "Sure, anything you want." He says to me, "Why did the Jews get rid of Bibi?" He said, "He was great." I said, "I know." And they say to me, I said, "Why do you say that?" He said, "Fleur, when Bibi was the prime minister," this is the Arab guy from the north of Israel who has a huge farm and agricultural land. He said to me, "When Bibi was in charge, I could get in 40 Palestinian workers to work on my farm. Today, I have to fill out 60 forms to get one." So just a perspective, a very an unexpected perspective from the Arabs about the fact that Bibi had respect, not just from Israelis, but very much so from the Arab world.
Have you felt anything in Jerusalem with respect to the national government and how they interact with Jerusalem? Do you feel, because you were there when it was the previous government and now with this government, I'd be interested to hear how that relationship is going.
Well, look, we have a very good mayor. He's a very strong mayor, and he has a great relationship with the Likud and Lieberman's party, who's now finance minister. And so we haven't really felt anything. But what I can tell you is that in the plan that Mansour Abbas, who's in the government, made with the government of Israel, where the Arab community around the country is getting over 50 billion shekels, East Jerusalem was not included. And now we're going to have to pass our own law to get more money for development in East Jerusalem. And that, of course, is a political statement from Mansour Abbas that he didn't include the Arabs in East Jerusalem as part of the Arabs in Israel. But in practice, we will end up getting that money through a different law. But that is an example of what we've seen so far. But in general, like I said, because the mayor is so committed and so well connected to all government opposition, and when the government was Likud, then we haven't, thank God, suffered at all, because he's a strong mayor, and the city represents 11% of the population of the state of Israel. We're the largest city by double. And so we're almost like our own little kingdom here, and we're doing as best we can.
Or your position is, and I think it's the position of many people, that if you increase someone's standard of living or you give them more benefits, they are less likely to oppose you. How do you reconcile that belief, which feels good, certainly, with the fact that the Palestinians rejected Trump's deal of the century?
Well, like I said, the Palestinians are the masters of cutting their nose to spite their face. And at the time, I said to them something very simple. You know, when Ben Gurion had to convince his entire party that we should take whatever sliver we are given rather than not take anything at all and try to go for the whole Transjordan deal, which was originally offered to the Jewish leadership of pre-state Israel, we were practical. We took what we could rather than not take anything at all. The Palestinians continue to play a double or nothing, and at the moment, and they will continue to get nothing as long as they don't accept the fact that we're not going anywhere. And so how do I reconcile it? The leadership is corrupt. The people are getting fed up with the leadership. And what they do is they create and curate a conflict every time their people are getting angry with them in order to stay in power. Very corrupt leadership, don't care about their people, only care about lining their pockets. And so when you have that type of leadership on the other side, what can you do? All we can do is strengthen ourselves, do the right thing, and continue growing.
I have two questions from Nira Abramowitz, who is on the board. The first question is, why aren't we calling a Sheikh Jarrah by its actual Hebrew name?
100% correct. I correct myself, Shimon HaTzadik. So it is. In the poster, as you walk in to Shimon HaTzadik, it says Sheikh Jarrah. It says Shimon HaTzadik. And you're right. The reason I refer to it as Sheikh Jarrah is because when I am interviewed in the foreign media, that is the context. But I have tried to correct myself as often as I possibly can, and thank you for reminding me.
Wonderful. The second question from Nira is, now that some of the corruption that was exposed regarding the assault on Netanyahu from his opponents using the police, or now that it's been exposed, will there be an investigation?
Look, I think that first of all, before the investigation, which I think there'll be a government inquiry on all of that. But the first question is, and I'm a lawyer by profession, what evidence against Netanyahu is food from the poison tree, which is a legal American term, actually, about gathering evidence illegally. And I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for the prosecution to separate the evidence that has been gathered from illegal wiretapping from the rest of the evidence. And I think this actually could be something that exonerates Benjamin Netanyahu, and I certainly hope so.
We have a wonderful practical question that affects everybody's lives on a daily basis. So I'm delighted to read the question from Mike Brutman. Does the first line of the light rail in Jerusalem meet expectations? And will there be further development of the light rail system? And will the further development fundamentally transform public transport in Jerusalem?
So that's a great question, and that is the plan. We have 7 lines overall. So one's already built, 6 more lines in planning. In the next 5 years, 2 more lines being built, the blue line and the green line. We already have the train from Tel Aviv, which takes half an hour. Many
Fleur,
people.
Is there any plan on the books to have a line that comes directly from the train? It's because you get off the train 25 minutes from Tel Aviv, and then the buses are there, but it would be nice if there was light rail. Right.
Well, there is a light rail at the moment.
Oh, there is, right?
Yes, from the central bus station to the center of town, all the way to City Hall. You guys can come and see me. 10 minutes. There's a line that comes straight. It goes through the coolest areas. So you go from the central bus. You get off from the Tel Aviv. You get on the light rail. You go to the Shuk. So you can go to the Shuk, you go to Kikar Tzion, Zion Square, you can come to City Hall, and then it continues all the way up to Hebrew University and through the Arab neighborhoods. When the Arabs complained that we were occupying the city, the biggest users of the light rail are the Arabs in East Jerusalem. They love it. And so that is only one line. That line is going to be extended on through Har Herzl. It goes now to Har Herzl. It's going to continue all the way to Hadassah Hospital. And on the other side, it's going to be extended all the way to north of Jerusalem.
And it's all with Rav Kof.
always Rav Kaf. And then the new lines are going to go from Ramot to the German colony. Another line is going to go to Malchamol, all the way through Talpiot. There's another line going all the way to Gilo. The idea is that the whole of Jerusalem will be networked with light rail. Look, I always say for public transport to be appealing, for people to leave their cars at home, it has to be easier than driving. Nobody's going to, for philosophical or value reasons, leave their car at home and schlep, harder or further in a light rail. I lived in London for 9 years. Some people on this call, I'm sure, from New York. Nobody would dream of getting the car in New York because the subway is faster. And so the only way people are going to give up their cars for public transport is if it's easier. And it will be easier once Jerusalem is completely networked with a light rail. And from my house in Baka, which is southwest Jerusalem, if I can get to Tel Aviv in 45 minutes and driving takes me an hour and a half, that's when I will take the light rail and not my car.
If I can get back to some national and international, questions, going back to the Abraham Accords and what we're doing with the Gulf here in Israel, have you felt any effect, or what has been the effect of the current administration in the U.S. on those relationships and on pushing things forward? I know you said that things are blossoming, but has there been any effect? I guess the question is, has it slowed down because of the challenges that we seem to face from the U.S. administration, who is still calling for two-state solutions and still with the mindset that until you fix the Israeli-Palestinian problem, we're not going to move forward, almost blind, as it seems, to what is actually going on?
So thankfully, I have to say that, the beauty of this being a different peace and different normalization, in the sense it's people to people. And people say to me, oh, but the government's not leading. And I say to them, that's great, because that means that this is a sustainable peace. When you have peace with a government and the government changes, like could happen in Jordan or Egypt, then we're like what happened with Morsi before Sisi. That's a problem. But when normalization and peace is a real organic thing between people to people, then it's in much safer hands. And this has got its own momentum. Having said that, I have to say that Tom Nides, the new US ambassador to Israel, is very supportive of the Abraham Accords. His people have already reached out to me and we're planning events together. And so I'm very happy to report that in terms of the American embassy in Jerusalem, they are very supportive of the Abraham Accords.
Okay, good to know. And Fleur, there's no thought or suggestion in the air at all about removing the consulate in Jerusalem? It's
No.
a question. Nothing.
No. Thank God, no. I'm involved. I'm the liaison. I'm the liaison for the State Department and the American Embassy in terms of their building plans and development. And they're very much on board. The decision changed and that's it. And the ambassador is moved to Jerusalem, lives in Jerusalem, and nobody's going anywhere. Thank the Lord.
So we asked this question last time we had you, and with the time we have left, I want to throw it out there once again, and that is with respect to all that you've done up until now in becoming the deputy mayor, after having been on the city council and developing various organizations. Do you have any national aspirations?
So you always ask me this, Adam.
That's why I resisted. I did not want to ask Fleur that question.
It's fine. I'm happy. Look, ultimately, I moved to Israel to serve my people. I found my political home in the Likud because I believe in the values of the founders of the Likud. I am right-wing. I'm a liberal as well, liberal in economic terms. Israel is a country steeped in socialist roots, which served it at the time, but no longer serves it in a modern startup nation economy. And I'm a liberal in terms of people being able to live together and practice what they want. And so this is what I believe in, and I will serve that agenda and my people in the best place possible. I love Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the center of the Jewish world, not just the center of the state of Israel. In the future, I would love to consider, if I have enough support, running in the Likud primaries and being able to be in the Knesset And, ultimately politics is a lot about timing. And as long as people keep voting for me, then I will be here. I will show up, as we say in Hebrew, hineni.
That is a wonderful response.
Thank you.
Terrific response. So
I want to thank you,
we're done?
Fleur, and I want to thank you, Sarah, for joining us this evening and this afternoon, wherever you may be. And we do look forward to actually meeting with you in person at City Hall.
Tell me when you're coming. We'll book the
Ooh.
model room, which is the model of Jerusalem, where you see the planning for the next 10 years of Jerusalem. And so when you have a date, I'd love to be able to book you guys in and receive you face to face in City Hall.
Well, I can put it out there now to all those of you who are on this call, and we'll put it out there as well, that we are looking very hard at the middle of May, and we will get more details as time goes on. But again, thank you, Deputy Mayor Fleur, Hassan, Nahoum.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, and have a good one. Everyone stay safe, be healthy. Bye-bye.